Chapter 8, Preparations for a War of Extermination. Where was the Vaudois who would put his life in his hand and carry this remonstrance to the Duke? The dangerous service was undertaken by M. Gilles, pastor of Briccaracio, a devoted and courageous man. A companion was associated with him, but wearied out with the rebuffs and insults he met, he abandoned the mission and left its conduct to Gilles alone. That's Gilles. I'm not sure if it's Giles or Gilles. The Duke then lived in Nice, for Turin, his capital, was still in the hands of the French, and the length of the journey was very considerably increased its risks. Gilles reached Nice in safety, however, and after many difficulties and delays, he had an interview with Queen Margaret, who undertook to place the representations of which he was the bearer in the hands of her husband, the Duke. The deputy had an interview also with Philip of Savoy, the Duke's brother, and one of the commissioners under the Act for the Purgation of the Valleys. The Waldensian pastor was, on the whole, well received by him. Unequally yoked with the cruel and bigoted Count La Trinita, Philip of Savoy soon became disgusted and left the bloody business wholly in the hands of his fellow commissioner. As regarded the queen, her heart was in the valleys. The cause of the poor Vaudois was her cause also, but she stood alone as their intercessor with the Duke. Her voice was drowned by the solicitations and threats of the prelates, the King of Spain, and the Pope. For 3 months there came neither letter nor edict from the court at Nice. If the men of the valleys were impatient to know the fate that awaited them, their enemies, athirst for plunder and blood, were still more so. The latter, unable longer to restrain their passions, began persecution on their own account. They thought they knew their sovereign's intentions, and made bold to anticipate them. The tocsin was rung out from the monastery of Pinerolo. Perched on the frontier of the valleys, the monks of this establishment kept their eyes fixed upon the heretics of the mountains, as vultures watched their prey, ever ready to sweep down upon hamlet or valley when they found it unguarded. They hired a troop of marauders, whom they sent forth to pillage. The band returned, driving before them a wretched company of captives, whom they had dragged from their homes and vineyards in the mountains. The poorer sort they burned alive or sent to the galleys. The rich they imprisoned till they had paid the ransom to which they were held. The example of the monks was followed by certain popish landlords in the valley of San Martino. The 2 seigneurs of Perrier attacked, before daybreak of April 2nd, 1560, the villagers of Rio Clarito with an armed band. Some they slaughtered, the rest they drove out, without food or clothes, to perish on the snow-clad hills. The ruffians who had expelled them took possession of their dwellings, protesting that no one should enter them unless he were willing to go to Mass. They kept possession only 3 days, for the Protestants of the valley of Clusson, to the number of 400, hearing of the outrage, crossed the mountains, drove out the invaders, and reinstated their brethren. Next appeared in the valleys Philip of Savoy, Count de Raconis, the chief commissioner. He was an earnest Roman Catholic, but a humane and upright man. He attended sermon one day in the Protestant church of Grosvenor, and was so much pleased with what he heard that he obtained from the pastor an outline of the Vaudois faith, so as to send it to Rome in the hope that the Pope would cease to persecute a creed that seemed so little heretical. A sanguine hope truly. Where the honest Count had seen very little heresy, the Pope, Pius IV, saw a great deal, and would not even permit a disputation with the Waldensian pastors, as the Count had proposed. He would stretch his benignity no farther than to absolve, quote, from their past crimes, all who were willing to enter the Church of Rome. This was not very encouraging. Still the Count did not abandon his idea of conciliation. In June 1560, he came a second time to the valley of Lucerna, accompanied by his colleague, La Trinita, and assembling the pastors and heads of families, he told them that the persecution would cease immediately, provided they would consent to hear the preachers he had brought with him, brothers of the Christian doctrine. He further proposed that they should silence their own ministers while they were making trial of his. The Vaudois expressed their willingness to consent, provided the count's ministers preached the pure gospel, but if they preached human traditions, they, the Vaudois, would be under the necessity of withholding their consent. And as regarded silencing their own ministers, it was only reasonable that they should be permitted first to make trial of the count's preachers. A few days after, they had a taste of the new expositors. Selecting the ablest among them, they made him ascend the pulpit and hold forth to a Vaudois congregation. He took a very effectual way to make them listen. "I will demonstrate to you," he said, "that the Mass is found in Scripture. The word massa signifies sent, does it not?" "Not precisely," replied his hearers, who knew more about Hebrew than was convenient for the preacher. "The primitive expression," continued he, "et missa est, was employed to dismiss the auditory, was it not?" "That is quite true," replied his hearers, without very clearly seeing how it bore on his argument. "Well, then, you see, gentlemen, that the Mass is found in the Holy Scriptures." The congregation were unable to determine whether the preacher was arguing with them or simply laughing at them. Finding the Waldenses obdurate, as he deemed them, the Duke of Savoy, in October 1560, declared war against them. Early in that month, a dreadful rumor reached the valleys, namely that the Duke was levying an army to exterminate them. The news was but too true. The Duke offered a free pardon to all, quote, outlaws, convicts, and vagabonds, who would enroll as volunteers to serve against the Vaudois. Soon an army of truly dreadful character was assembled. Vaudois seemed doomed to total and inevitable destruction. The pastors and chief persons assembled to deliberate on the measures to be taken at this terrible crisis. Feeling that their refuge was in God alone, they resolved that they would take no means for deliverance which might be offensive to him or dishonorable to themselves. The pastors were to exhort everyone to apply to God with true faith, sincere repentance, and ardent prayer, and as to defensive measures, they recommended that each family should collect their provisions, clothes, utensils, and herds, and be ready at a moment's notice to convey them, together with all infirm persons, to their strongholds in the mountains. While the Duke's army, if the collected ruffianism of Piedmont could be so called, came nearer every day. On the 31st of October, a proclamation was posted throughout the valley of Grojna, calling on the inhabitants to return within the Roman Pale, under penalty of extermination by fire and sword. On the day following, the 1st of November, the papal army appeared at Bubiana, on the right bank of the Pelisse, at the entrance to the Waldensian valleys. The host numbered 4,000 infantry and 200 horse, comprising, besides the desperadoes that formed its main body, a few veterans who had seen a great deal of service in the wars with France. The Vaudois, the enemy being now in sight, humbled themselves in a public fast before God. Next they partook together of the Lord's Supper. Refreshed in soul by these services, they proceeded to put in execution the measures previously resolved on. The old men and the women climbed the mountains, awakening the echoes with the psalms which they sang on their way to Prat del Tor, within whose ramparts of rock and snow-clad peaks they sought asylum. The Vaudois population of the valleys at that time was not more than 18,000. Their armed men did not exceed 1,200. These were distributed at various passes and barricades to oppose the enemy who was now near. On the 2nd of November, the Piedmontese army, putting itself in motion, crossed the Pelisse and advanced along the narrow defile that leads up to the valleys, having the heights of Bricaracio on the right and the spurs of Monte Friolante on the left. And, of course, he goes into more descriptions of different mountain peaks. Let's see. It was the latter of these two valleys, Grojna and that La Trinita first essayed to enter. He marched 1,200 men into it, the wings of its army deploying over its bordering height of La Cotière. His soldiers were opposed by only a small body of Vaudois, some of whom were armed solely with the sling and the crossbow. Skirmishing with the foe, the Vaudois retired, fighting to the higher grounds. When the evening set in, neither side could claim a decided advantage. Wearied with skirmishing, both armies encamped for the night, the Vaudois on the heights of Rocamone, and the Piedmontese, their camp fires lighted on the lower hills of La Côtière. Suddenly the silence of the evening was startled by a derisive shout that rose from the Piedmontese host. What had happened to evoke these sounds of contempt? They had descried, between them and the sky, on the heights above them, the bending figures of the Vaudois. On their knees, the Waldensian warriors were supplicating the god of battles. Hardly had the scoffs with which the Piedmontese hailed the act died away, when a drum was heard to beat in a side valley. A child had got hold of the instrument and was amusing itself with it. The soldiers of La Trinité saw in imagination a fresh body of Waldensians advancing from this lateral defile to rush upon them. They seized their arms in no little disorder. The Vaudois, seeing the movement of the foe, seized theirs also, and rushed downhill to anticipate the attack. The Piedmontese threw away their arms and fled, chased by the Waldenses, thus losing in half an hour the ground it had cost them a day's fighting to gain. The weapons abandoned by the fugitives formed a much-needed and most opportune supply to the Vaudois. As the result of the combats of the day, La Trinité had 67 men slain. Of the Vaudois, 3 only had fallen. Opening on the left of La Trinité was the corn-clad, vine-clad, and mountain-ramparted valley of Lucerna, with its towns, forming the noblest of the Waldensian valleys. Those that remained were mostly Romanists, who were, at the time, mixed with the Waldensian population, and even they, committing their wives and daughters to the keeping of their Vaudois neighbors, had sent them with them to the Prat del Tour to escape the brutal outrages of the papal army. On the following days, La Trinité fought some small affairs with the Vaudois, in all of which he was repulsed with considerable slaughter. The arduous nature of the task he had in hand now began to dawn upon him. So basically the Vaudois are winning in this fight. The mountaineers, he saw, were courageous and determined to die rather than submit their conscience to the Pope and their families to the passions of his soldiers. He discovered, moreover, that they were a simple and confiding people, utterly unversed in the ways of intrigue. He was delighted to find these qualities in them, because he thought he saw how he could turn them to account. He had tools with him as cunning and vile as himself. Jacomel, the inquisitor, and Gastod, his secretary. The latter feigned a love for the gospel. These men he set to work. When they had prepared matters, he assembled the leading men of the Waldenses, and recited to them some flattering words which he had heard, or professed to have heard, the Duke and Duchess make use of toward them. He protested that this was no pleasant business in which he was engaged, and that he would be glad to have it off his hands. Peace, he thought, could easily be arranged, if they could only make a few small concessions to show that they were reasonable men. He would propose that they should deposit their arms in the house of one of the syndics, and permit him, for form's sake, to go with a small train and celebrate Mass in the church of St. Lorenzo in Angrogna, and afterward pay a visit to the Prat del Tour. La Trinité's proposal proved the correctness of the estimate he had formed of Vaudois confidingness. The people spent a whole night in deliberating over the Count's proposition, and contrary to the opinion of their pastors and some of their laymen, agreed to accept it. The papal general said his Mass in the Protestant church. After this he traversed the gloomy defiles that led up to the famous Prat, on whose green slopes with their snowy battlements he was so desirous to feast his eyes, though it is said he showed evident trepidation when he passed the black pool of Tampé with its memories of retribution. Having accomplished these feats in safety, he returned to wear the mask a little longer. He resumed the efforts on which he professed to be so earnestly and laudably bent, of effecting peace. The Duke had now come nearer, and was living at Vercelli, on the plain of Piedmont. La Trinité thought that the Vaudois ought by all means to send deputies thither. It would strengthen their supplication, indeed all but ensure of success, if they would raise a sum of 20,000 crowns. On payment of this sum he would withdraw his army and leave them to practice their religion in peace. The Vaudois, unable to conceive of dissimulation like La Trinitas, made concession after concession. They had previously laid down their arms. They now sent deputies to the Duke. Next they taxed themselves to buy off his soldiers, and last, worst of all, at the demand of La Trinita, they sent away their pastors. It was dreadful to think of a journey across the Col Julien at that season, yet it had to be gone. Over its snowy summits, where the winter drifts were continually obliterating the track and piling up fresh wreaths, across the valleys of Preli and San Martino, and over the ice-clad mountains beyond, had this sorrowful band of pastors to pursue their way to find refuge among the Protestants in the French valley of Progelus. This difficult and dangerous route was forced upon them, the more direct road through the valley of Perosa being closed by the marauders and assassins that infested it, and especially by those in the pay of the monks of Pinarillo. The Count believed that the poor people were now entirely in his power. His soldiers did their pleasure in the valley of Lucerna. They pillaged the houses abandoned by the Vaudois. The few inhabitants who had remained, as well as those who had returned, thinking that during the negotiations for peace hostilities would be suspended, were fain to make their escape a second time, and to seek refuge in the woods and caves of the higher reaches of the valleys. The outrages committed by the ruffians to whom the valley of Lucerna was now given over were of a kind that cannot be told. The historian Giles has recorded a touching instance. A helpless man who had lived 103 years was placed in a cave, and his granddaughter, a girl of 17, was left to take care of him. The soldiers found out his hiding place. The old man was murdered, and outrage was offered to his granddaughter. She fled from the brutal pursuit of the soldiers, leaped over a precipice, and died. In another instance, an old man was pursued to the brink of a precipice by one of La Trinita's soldiers. The Vaudois had no alternative but to throw himself over the brink or die by the sword of his pursuer. He stopped, turned around, and dropped on his knees as if to supplicate for his life. The trooper was raising his sword to strike him dead when the Vaudois, clasping him tightly round the legs and swaying himself backward with all his might, rolled over the precipice, dragging the soldier with him into the abyss. Part of the sum agreed upon between La Trinita and the Waldenses had now been paid to him. To raise this money, the poor people were under the necessity of selling their herds. The Count now withdrew his army into winter quarters at Cavour, a point so near the valleys that a few hours' march would enable him to re-enter them at any moment. The corn and oil and wine he had not been able to carry away he destroyed. Even the mills he broke in pieces. His design appeared to be to leave the Vaudois only the alternative of submission or of dying of hunger on their mountains. To afflict them yet more, he placed garrisons here and there in the valleys, and in the very wantonness of tyranny, required those who were themselves without bread to provide food for his soldiers. These soldiers were continually prowling about in search of victims on whom to gratify their cruelty and their lust. Those who had the unspeakable misfortune to be dragged into their den had to undergo, if men, excruciating torture, if women, revolting outrage. Chapter 9. The Great Campaign of 1561. These frightful inflictions the Waldenses had submitted to in the hope that the deputies whom they had sent to the Duke would bring back with them an honorable peace. The impatience with which they waited their return may well be conceived. At last, after an absence of 6 weeks, the commissioners reappeared in the valleys, but their dejected faces, even before they had uttered a word, told that they had not succeeded. They had been sent back with an order enjoining on the Vaudois unconditional submission to the Church of Rome on pain of extermination. To enforce that order to the uttermost, a more numerous army was at that moment being raised. the mass or universal slaughter. Such was the alternative now presented to them. The spirit of the people woke up. Rather than thus disgrace their ancestors, imperil their own souls, and entail a heritage of slavery on their children, they would die 1,000 times. Their depression was gone. They were as men who had awakened from heavy sleep. They had found their arms. Their first care was to recall their pastors, their next to raise up their fallen churches, and their third to resume public service in them. Daily their courage grew, and once more joy lighted up their faces. There came letters of sympathy and promises of help from their fellow Protestants of Geneva, Dauphin, and France. Over the two latter countries, persecution at that hour impended, but their own dangers made them more ready to succor the brethren of the valleys. Thereupon, says a historian, took place one of these grand and solemn scenes, which, at once heroic and religious, seem rather adapted for an epic poem than for grave history. The Waldenses of Lucerne sent deputies across the mountains, then covered to a great depth with snow, to propose an alliance with the Protestants of the valley of Progellus, who were at that time threatened by their sovereign, Francis I. The proposed alliance was joyfully accepted. Assembling on a plateau of snow, facing the mountains of Sestieres and the chain of Guenevert, the deputies swore to stand by each other and render mutual support in the coming struggle. It was agreed that this oath of allegiance should be sworn with a like solemnity in the Waldensian valleys. The deputies from Progellus, crossing the Mount Julien, arrived at Bobbio on the 21st of January, 1561. Their coming was singularly opportune. On the evening before, a ducal proclamation had been published in the valleys, commanding the Vaudois, within 24 hours, to give attendance at Mass or abide the consequences. Fire, sword, and cord, the three arguments of Romanism, says Muston. This was the first news with which the Progellese deputies were met on their arrival. With all the more enthusiasm they proceeded to renew their oath. Ascending a low hill behind Bobbio, the deputies from Progellus and those from Lucerne, standing erect in the midst of the assembled heads of families who kneeled around, pronounced these words: "In the name of the Vaudois churches of the Alps, of Dauphin, and of Piedmont, which have ever been united, and of which we are the representatives, we here promise, our hands on our Bibles, and in the presence of God, that all our valleys shall courageously sustain each other in matters of religion, without prejudice to the obedience due to their legitimate superiors. We promise to maintain the Bible, whole and without admixture, according to the usage of the true apostolic church, persevering in this holy religion, though it be at the peril of our life, in order that we may transmit it to our children, intact and pure, as we received it from our fathers. We promise aid and succor to our persecuted brothers, not regarding our individual interests, but the common cause, and not relying upon man, but upon God." The physical grandeurs of the spot were in meet accordance with the moral sublimity of the transaction. Okay, and then he has more geography description. The next morning, according to the Duke's order, they must choose between the Mass and the penalty annexed to refusal. A neighboring church, one of those which had been taken from them, stood ready, with altar decked and tapers lighted, for the Vaudois to hear their first Mass. Hardly had the day dawned when the expected penitents were at the church door. They would show the Duke in what fashion they meant to read their recantation. They entered the building. A moment they stood surveying the strange transformation of their church had undergone, and then they set to work to extinguish the tapers, pull down the images, and sweep into the street rosary and crucifix, and all the other paraphernalia of the popish worship, was but the work of a few minutes. The minister, Humbert Artus, then ascended the pulpit, and reading out as his text Isaiah 45:20, "Assemble yourselves and come, draw near together, ye that are escaped of the nations. They have no knowledge that set up the wood of their graven image, and pray unto a God that cannot save," preached a sermon which struck the keynote of the campaign then opening. The inhabitants of the hamlets and chalets in the mountains rushed down, like their own winter torrents, into Lucerna, and the army of the Vaudois, reinforced, set out to purge the temple at Vallaro. On their way they encountered the Piedmontese garrison. They attacked and drove them back, the monks, seigneurs, and magistrates, who had come to receive the abjuration of the heretics, accompanying the troops in their ignominious flight. The whole band of fugitives, soldiers, priests, and judges, shut themselves up in the town of Vallaro, which was now besieged by the Vaudois. Thrice did the garrison from La Tour attempt to raise the siege, and thrice they were repulsed. At last, on the 10th day, the garrison surrendered, and had their lives spared, 2 Waldensian pastors accompanying them to La Tour, the soldiers expressing greater confidence in them than in any other escort. The Count La Trinita, seeing his garrison driven out, struck his encampment at Cavour, and moved his army into the valleys. He again essayed to sow dissension among the Vaudois by entangling them in negotiations for peace, but by this time they had learned too well the value of his promises to pay the least attention to them, or to intermit for an hour their preparations for defense. It was now the beginning of February 1561. The Vaudois labored with the zeal of men who feel that their cause is a great and a righteous one, and are prepared to sacrifice all for it. They erected barricades, they planted ambushes, they appointed signals to telegraph the movements of the enemy from post to post. Every house, says Muston, became a manufactory of pikes, bullets, and other weapons. They selected the best marksmen their valleys could furnish, and formed them into the Flying Company, whose duty it was to hasten to the point where danger pressed the most. To each body of fighting men they attached 2 pastors to maintain the morale for their army. The pastors, morning and evening, led the public devotions. They prayed with the soldiers before going into battle, and when the fighting was over and the Vaudois were chasing the enemy down their great mountains and through their dark gorges, they exerted themselves to prevent the victory from being stained by any unnecessary effusion of blood. La Trinita knew well that if he would subjugate the valleys and bring the campaign to a successful end, he must make himself master of the Prat del Tour. Into that vast natural citadel was now gathered the main body of the Waldensian people. Their herds and provisions remained to them had been transported thither. There they had constructed mills and baking ovens. There too sat their council, and thence directed the whole operations of the defense. A blow struck there would crush the Vaudois heart, and convert what the Waldenses regarded as their impregnable castle into their tomb. Deferring the chastisement of the other valleys meanwhile, the La Trinita directed all his efforts against Angrogna. His first attempt to enter it with his army was made on the 4th of February. The fighting lasted till night and ended in his repulse. His second attempt, 3 days after, carried him some considerable way into Angrogna, burning and ravaging, but his partial success cost him dear, and the ground won had ultimately to be abandoned. The 14th of February saw the severest struggle. Employing all his strategy to make himself master of the much-coveted Prat with all in it, he divided his army into 3 corps and advanced against it from 3 points. One body of troops, marching along the gorges of the Androgna and traversing the narrow chasm that leads up to the Prat, attacked it on the south. Another body, climbing the heights from Pramol and crossing the snowy flanks of Lavacera, tried to force an entrance on the east, while a third, ascending from San Martino and crossing the lofty summits that wall in the Prat on the north, descended upon it from that quarter. The Count's confident expectation was that if his men should be unable to force an entrance at one point, they were sure to do so at another. No scout had given warning of what was approaching. While 3 armies were marching to attack them, the Waldenses in their grand valley, with its rampart of ice-crowned peaks, were engaged in their morning devotions. Suddenly the cries of fugitives and the shouts of assailants, issuing from the narrow chasm on the south, broke upon their ear, together with the smoke of burning hamlets. Of the 3 points of attack, this was the easiest to be defended. 6 brave Waldensian youths strode down the valley to stop the way against the Latrinita's soldiers. They were 6 against an army. The road by which the soldiers were advancing is long and gloomy, overhung by great rocks, and so narrow that only 2 men can march abreast. On this side rises the mountain, on that, farther down, thunders the torrent. It's a lot more geography. To friend and foe alike, the only entrance into the Pra del Tor on the south is by this gate of nature's own erecting. It was here that the 6 Waldensian warriors took their stand. Immovable as their own Alps, they not only checked the advance of the host, but drove it back in a panic-stricken mass, which made the precipices of the defile doubly fatal. Others would have hastened to their aid, but had not danger suddenly presented itself in another quarter. On the heights of Lavachera, crossing the snow, was descried an armed troop, making their entrance into the valley on the east. Before they had time to descend, they were met by the Waldenses, who dispersed them and made them flee. 2 of the attacking parties of the Count have failed. Will the 3rd have better success? As the Waldenses were pursuing the routed army on Lavachera, they saw yet another armed troop, which had crossed the mountains that separate the Val San Martino from the Pra del Tor on the north, descending upon them. Instantly the alarm was raised. A few men only could they dispatch to meet the invaders. These lay in ambush at the mouth of the defile through which the attacking party was making its way down into the Pra. Emerging from the defile and looking down into the valleys beneath them, they exclaimed, "Haste, haste, and Grojna is ours!" The Vaudois, starting up and crying out, "It is you that are ours!" rushed upon them, sword in hand. Trusting to their superior numbers, the Piedmontese soldiers fought desperately. But a few minutes sufficed for the men of the valleys to hurry from the points where they were now victorious to the assistance of their brethren. The invaders, seeing themselves attacked on all sides, turned and fled up the slopes they had just descended. Many were slain, nor would a man of them have recrossed the mountains but for the pastor of the flying company, who, raising his voice to the utmost pitch, the pursuers, to spare the lives of those who were no longer able to resist. Among the slain was Charles Truchet, who so cruelly ravaged the commune at Rio Claret a few months before. A stone from a sling laid him prostrate on the ground, and his head was cut off with his own sword. Louis de Mantuel, another noted persecutor of the Vaudois, perished in the same action. Furious at his repulse, the Count La Trinita turned his arms against the almost defenseless valley of Rora. He ravaged it, burning its little town and chasing away its population of 80 families, who escaped over the snows of the mountains to Vellaro in the valley of Lucerna. That valley he next entered with his soldiers, and though it was for the moment almost depopulated, the Popish general received so warm a welcome from those peasants who remained that, after being again and again beaten, he was fain to draw off his men at arms and retreat to his old quarters at Cavour, there to chew the cud over his misfortunes and hatch new stratagems and plan new attacks, which he fondly hoped would retrieve his disgraces. La Trinita spent a month in reinforcing his army, greatly weakened by the losses it had sustained. The King of France sent him 10 companies of foot and some other choice soldiers. There came a regiment from Spain, and numerous volunteers from Piedmont, comprising many of the nobility. From 4,000, the original number of his army, it was now raised to 7,000. He thought himself strong enough to begin a 3rd campaign. He was confident that this time he would wipe out the disgrace which had befallen his arms, and sweep from the earth at once and forever the great scandal of the Waldenses. He again directed all his efforts against Grojna, the heart and bulwark of the valleys. It was Sunday, the 17th of March, 1561. The whole of the Vaudois assembled in the Pra del Tor had met on the morning of that day, soon after dawn, as was their wont, to unite in public devotion. The first rays of the rising sun were beginning to light up the white hills around them, and the last cadences of their morning psalm were dying away on the grassy slopes of the Pra, when a sudden alarm was raised. The enemy was approaching by 3 routes. On the ridges of the eastern summits appeared one body of armed men, another was defiling up the chasm, and in a few minutes would pour itself through the gateway already described into the Pra, while a third was forcing itself over the rocks by a path intermediate between the two. Instantly the enemy was met on all the points of approach. A handful of Waldensians sufficed to thrust back along the narrow gorge the line of glittering, cuirassed men who were defiling through it. At the other 2 points, where bastions of rock and earth had been erected, the fighting was severe, and the dead lay thick, but the day at both places went against the invaders. Some of the ablest captains were among the slain. The number of the soldiers killed was so great that Count La Trinita is said to have sat down and wept when he beheld the heaps of the dead. It was matter of astonishment at the time that the Waldenses did not pursue the invaders, for had they done so, being so much better acquainted with the mountain paths, not one of all that host would have been left alive to carry tidings of its discomfiture to the inhabitants of Piedmont. Their pastors restrained the victorious Vaudois, having laid it down as a maxim at the beginning of the campaign that they would use with moderation and clemency whatever victories the god of battles might be pleased to give them, and that they would spill no blood unless when absolutely necessary to prevent their own being shed. The number of slain Piedmontese was again out of all proportion to those who had fallen on the other side, so much so that it was currently said in the cities of Piedmont that God was fighting for the Barbettes. Since a pastor is a barb, I'm assuming that means just a congregant. More deeply humiliated and disgraced than ever, La Trinita led back the remains of his army to its old quarters. Well had it been for him if he had never set foot within the Waldensian territory, and not less so for many of those who followed him, including not a few of the nobles of Piedmont, whose bones were now bleaching on the mountains of the Vaudois. But the Popish general was slow to learn the lesson of these events. Even yet he harbored the design of returning to assail that fatal valley where he had lost so many laurels and buried so many soldiers, but he covered his purpose with craft. Negotiations had been opened between the men of the valleys and the Duke of Savoy, and as they were proceeding satisfactorily, the Vaudois were without suspicions of evil. This was the moment that La Trinita chose to attack them. He hastily assembled his troops, and on the night of the 16th of April he marched them against the Prat del Tour, hoping to enter it unopposed and give the Vaudois as sheep to the slaughter. The snows around the Pra were beginning to burn in the light of the morning when the attention of the people, who had just ended their united worship, was attracted by unusual sounds which were heard to issue from the gorge that led into the valley. On the instant, 6 brave mountaineers rushed to the gateway that opens from the gorge. The long file of La Trinita's soldiers was seen advancing 2 abreast, their helmets and cuirasses glittering in the light. The 6 Vaudois made their arrangements and calmly waited till the enemy was near. The first 2 Vaudois, holding loaded muskets, knelt down. The second 2 stood erect, ready to fire over the heads of the first 2. The third 2 undertook the loading of the weapons as they were discharged. The invaders came on. As the first 2 of the enemy turned the rock, they were shot down by the 2 foremost Vaudois. The next 2 of the attacking force fell in like manner by the shot of the Vaudois in rear. The third rank of the enemy presented themselves only to be laid by the side of their comrades. In a few minutes, a little heap of dead bodies blocked the paths, rendering impossible the advance of the accumulating file of the enemy in the chasm. Meanwhile, other Vaudois climbed the mountains that overhang the gorge in which the Piedmontese army was imprisoned. Tearing up the great stones with which the hillside was strewn, the Vaudois sent them rolling down upon the host. Unable to advance from the wall of dead in front, and unable to flee from the ever-accumulating masses behind, the soldiers were crushed in dozens by the falling rocks. Panic set in, and panic in such a position was dreadful. Wedged together on the narrow ledge, with a murderous rain of rocks falling on them, their struggle to escape was frightful. They jostled one another and trod each other underfoot, while vast numbers fell over the precipice and were dashed on the rocks or drowned in the torrent. When those at the entrance of the valley, who were watching the result, saw the crystal of the Angrogna begin about midday to be changed into blood, "Ah," they said, "the Pras del Tor has been taken, La Trinita has triumphed. There flows the blood of the Vaudois." And indeed, the Count on beginning his march that morning is said to have boasted that by noon the torrent of the Angrogna would be seen to change color, and so in truth it did. Instead of a pellucid stream rolling along on a white gravelly bed, which is its usual appearance at the mouth of the valley, it was now deeply dyed from recent slaughter. But when the few who had escaped the catastrophe returned to tell what had that day passed within the defiles of the Angrogna, it was seen that it was not the blood of the Vaudois, but the blood of their ruthless invaders, which dyed the waters of the Angrogna. The Count withdrew on that same night with his army to return no more to the valleys. Negotiations were again resumed, not this time through the Count La Trinita, but through Philip of Savoy, Count of Raconis, and were speedily brought to a satisfactory issue. The Duke of Savoy had but small merit in making peace with the men whom he found he could not conquer. The capitulation was signed on the 5th of June, 1561, and its first clause granted an indemnity for all offenses. It is open to remark that this indemnity was given to those who had suffered, not to those who had committed the offenses it condoned. The articles that followed permitted the Vaudois to erect churches in their valleys, with the exception of 2 or 3 of their towns, and to hold public worship, to celebrate all the offices of their religion. All the, quote, ancient franchises, immunities, and privileges, whether conceded by His Highness or by His Highness's predecessors, unquote, were renewed provided they were vouched by public documents. Such was the arrangement that closed this war of 15 months. The Vaudois ascribed it in great part to the influence of the good Duchess Margaret. The Pope designated it a pernicious example, which he feared would not want imitators in those times when the love of many to the Roman see was waxing cold. It stank in the nostrils of the prelates and monks of Piedmont, to whom the heretics had been a free booty. Nevertheless, Duke Emmanuel Philibert faithfully maintained its stipulations, the Duchess being by his side to counteract any pressure on the contrary direction. This peace, together with the summer that was now opening, began slowly to efface the deep scars persecution had left on the valleys, and what further helped to console and reanimate this brave but afflicted people were the sympathy and aid universally tendered them by Protestants abroad, in particular by Calvin and the Elector Palatine, the latter addressing a spirited letter to the Duke on behalf of his persecuted subjects. Nothing was more admirable than the spirit of devotion which the Vaudois exhibited all through these terrible conflicts. Their valleys resounded not less with the voice of prayer and praise than with the din of arms. Their opponents came from carousing, from blaspheming, from murdering, to engage in battle. The Waldenses rose from their knees to unsheath the sword, and wielded in a cause which they firmly believed to be that of him to whom they had bent in supplication. When their little army went afield, their barbs always accompanied it, to inspirit the soldiers by suitable exhortations before joining battle, and to moderate in it, in the hour of victory, a vengeance which, however excusable, would yet have tarnished the glory of the triumph. When the fighting men hastened to the bastion or to the defile, the pastors betook themselves to the mountain slope or to its summit, and there with uplifted hands supplicated help from the Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. When the battle had ceased, and the enemy were in flight, and the victors had returned from chasing their invaders from the valleys, the gray-haired pastor, the lion-hearted man of battle, the matron, the maiden, the stripling, and the little child, would assemble in the Pras del Tor, and while the setting sun was kindling into glory the mountain-tops of their once more ransomed land, they would raise their voices together and sing the old war song of Judah, in strains so heroic that the great rocks around them would send back the thunder of their praise in louder echoes than those of the battle whose triumphant issue they were celebrating.